December 8th, 1980, a deranged young man assassinated John Lennon. That same day, an RKO Radio crew recorded what would prove to be Lennon's final interview. RKO's Dave Sholin and Laurie Kaye interviewed John Lennon and Yoko Ono in their apartment at the Dakota in New York. On December 8, 2023, Laurie Kaye's memoir, Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, is set for release. Laurie joins the Plutopia Podcast this time as we discuss her book and explore the events in her life that led to the interview that still haunts her.
The entire interview was so amazing to me. And even though I knew how John and Yoko had met and got together, John and Yoko both told me the entire story of their original meetup. And it was so cool. And not only that, but their first date, which was 2 years later, and how that ended up being the night that they recorded Two Virgins, and the next morning when the sun came up, ended up making love for the first time. And it was so beautiful to hear them talk about that and remember it and just see the looks on their faces and the joy of memory. And not only that, but leading up to it, John talking about how excited he was to hear Yoko sing while he was singing, and how she brought out in him all the different part of his recording ability.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to another Plutopia Podcast. Our guest today is the wonderful Laurie Kaye. Laurie is a writer and a producer for television and film, and she was formerly a radio reporter and anchor, and she was the last person to interview John Lennon, and that was on the day that he died. She's written her memoir, Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, My Life Leading Up to John Lennon's Last Interview. And I think we decided to kick this off. Oh, I should introduce, I'm John Lebkowski.
And I'm Scoop Sweeney.
And we are the Plutopians. And I think we decided to kick this off with a reading. Do you want to read part of your book, Laurie?
Sure, I'll be happy to read the first page or two of the first chapter. And as you mentioned, it's my memoir, the story of my early radio-related life and career wrapped around what tragically turned out to be John Lennon's last day on the planet, December 8th, 1980, which is also when I co-conducted the RKO Radio interview with him and Yoko at the Dakota mere hours before he was shot and killed. And my book features details and quotes from many of my interviews, not just with John and Yoko, but with everybody from Paul and Linda to George Martin, Ramones, Talking Heads, you name it. They're all in the book, quoted and described. And plus, my book also has the stories about me being raised by my dysfunctional family and the important part that radio played in my upbringing. And there's also plenty of sex and drugs and rock and roll, my life story. And chapter 1 of my book, I should say that all the chapters of my book are named after hit songs, a lot of my favorite songs. And chapter 1 of my book is called Imagine, my lead up to Lennon. And I can read the first page and a half now. On December 8th, 1980, I was overflowing with excitement, anticipation, and disbelief as I approached the Dakota apartments on Manhattan's Upper West Side. I was there to play my part in John Lennon's one and only U.S. radio interview following the release of his and Yoko's brand new album, Double Fantasy. And the voices in my head were telling me that this was without a doubt about to become the best day of my life that I could ever even begin to imagine, and that I was truly the luckiest person on the planet. Visions of thousands of screaming Beatles fans packed into Dodger Stadium so many years earlier swirled through my brain like milkshake in a blender, and I could barely keep myself from swaggering down the sidewalk as my associates and I approached the security booth area right outside the Dakota's entrance. I'd flown out one day earlier from the West Coast as part of our 3-member RKO radio team, along with the executive from Warner Brothers Geffen Records. And although our radio RKO trio had already worked together on a number of attention-getting network radio rock specials and interviews over the past few years, including heading off to London just the year before to hang out with Paul McCartney and Wings, this would be an entirely different ballgame. After all, we were on the verge of meeting up with someone who'd literally disappeared from the music business for the previous 5 years, John Lennon. John had been hunkered down in the role of ultra-happy house husband and attentive father ever since his 18-month-long lost weekend, the time during which he was, by his own admission, miserably separated from Yoko and living in Los Angeles. And he hadn't recorded or released any new music in at least the 5 years since. But now, Double Fantasy, the new album created with his often critically reviled wife Yoko Ono, was his way of opening the door to the 80s and a whole new era. No one else in the world could even begin to imagine how it felt to realize that we were about to become the only American radio gang chosen to help John and Yoko usher that era in. The build-up to our interview had already been somewhat mind-blowing. At one point, while everything was still in the early planning stages, I got a call from someone asking the date, year, and time of my birth, because apparently Yoko was working with her personal astrologer, who was going to take all the information collected and then use it to put together an astrological chart that would then determine the best possible day for our Dakota meetup. Of course, the surprising thing is that even with all that intimate information, and despite the fact that John and Yoko had already planned to head to Hawaii and the West Coast during that time period, somehow Monday, December 8th, 1980, a date that will live forever in freakish rock and roll infamy, was chosen.
It's a great introduction to a fascinating book. I enjoyed the way you didn't just go right into the entire Lennon experience. You wove it through your entire upbringing and your early career to where it was all one unified story. And at the end, of course, is an incredible description of what you experienced, what the interview was like. And how did you come to be in radio? I understand you kind of lucked into it by winning a radio contest that determined your future path.
Absolutely. When I was in high school, I managed to win tickets from KMET FM to the Rolling Stones Nicaragua benefit at the Forum here in Los Angeles. And it was not only a super exciting thing to win the tickets, but when I went to go pick them up at the station, the DJ who gave them to me asked me my name and my age. And when he heard me start talking, he said, "Wow, with a voice like that, you need to be on the radio. That's your career." So he basically sent me in the right direction from that moment on. And even though it took me several years through college and everything, and then eventually going to UC Berkeley and being in the journalism school there and getting an internship at KFRC Radio, which was the top 40 station in the country at the time, RKO Radio station. And I got the internship and immediately loved it. And even though I didn't get a job there for a couple months afterwards, when I did, I was very lucky to be asked almost right away to write the Beatles special that RKO was about to produce, which was the longest Beatles special that was ever made in America. It started out at 14 hours, and eventually we expanded it to 17 hours. It was originally called RKO Presents the Beatles, and finally we were able to use my title, which I was really excited to write, which was The Beatles from Liverpool to Legend. And that's when it was 17 hours. And following that, I got to do a number of interviews, including George Harrison, Paul McCartney, George Martin, and then eventually we got the John Lennon and Yoko Ono interview, which was really exciting.
So you were actually the fifth Beatle.
Well, I don't know about that. Everybody claimed to be the fifth Beatle, so maybe I would be more like the 55th.
You early on had a love affair with radio from your little transistor radio, something that is a common theme through a lot of people's lives. I know I had one. I had a little red Philco radio that I carried with me all the time so I could listen to rock and roll. You know, Lou Reed sang about a girl's life being saved by rock and roll. Would you agree with that? Was it your life saved by rock and roll?
Absolutely. And I was a toddler too when I had my first transistor. It was also red, and it was so exciting because I got to spend all my nights with earplugs in my ears, listening to radio all night. And the top 40 stations in LA were so exciting for me, especially KHJ, which was the RKO sister station of KFRC, where I ended up working later. So it was cool.
Did you listen to Wolfman Jack?
Yes, I did.
We had a lot of Wolfman Jack where we lived.
Yes, indeed. John and I grew up in the same town in West Texas, and XERF in Mexico. It was I think a 100,000 watt station, and that was Wolfman Jack's base of operations for a long time. Certainly influenced a lot of us in Texas radio, at least.
Definitely one of my heroes.
You experienced a lot of ups and downs in your life, and it always seemed to be that music bailed you out. What were some of those things that you found in music that kept you going?
Well, not just songs that dealt with love and appreciation and getting through hard times, but live music concerts. Once I started going to concerts, it changed my life. It was something so exciting that I'd never even dreamed of how it could be so impressive and have such impact on my life. It was amazing because, of course, I'd seen bands and heard music on radio and on TV, but seeing it live was it's just like it is now. It's amazing. And that's, to be honest, the most tragic thing about COVID for me was the fact that we couldn't go to concerts. Nobody was performing. And I literally cried for over a year. And when I finally got to go back to my first concert after the pandemic's first year, it was amazing. And it was Blue Oyster Cult and Jefferson Starship. And it was incredible. It brought me back to my reality.
Wow, who's left in Jefferson Starship?
Well, it was a bunch of original types, of course, not Paul Kantner, who passed, and Grace Slick, who doesn't perform, but Grace Slick's daughter was there and actually did perform with the band. So
that's great.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting.
Legacy stuff. We're seeing a bit of that lately.
Yeah, that's starting to come back. All these young folks in Austin are starting to appreciate somewhat 70s music, but 80s new wave and punk has been, having a revival. One of my longtime projects is doing internet radio for the last 20 some odd years, and I have a new wave punk oldies station that all of a sudden just started getting all these listeners. And I was like, who are these people? It can't be the old folks. And a lot of people in their 20s and 30s suddenly decided that was cool music. I guess they tired of the current fare that's on the so-called top 40.
Well, punk and new wave was so exciting for me. It was a whole new direction. And being in San Francisco, where punk was really big, maybe not as big as New York, which had CBGBs and, gave birth to bands like Ramones and Talking Heads and Blondie and so many more. But San Francisco had a lot of native bands and a very big club called the Mabuhay, or the Fab Mab, as we called it, that had tremendous concerts. Everybody from Ramones and Devo and all the locals played there too. So that was really exciting and gave birth to punk rock for me and made it so I could start doing punk new wave specials and interviews while I was at KFRC. It was super exciting.
What do you think was distinctive about punk? What made punk punk?
It was so rock and roll, and it was so loud, and it was so fast, and it was so exciting, and lyrics were so interesting, and it related to my life, and it related to me and my original contact with music in the first place.
Yeah, you wrote about a lot of the shows in the Bay Area, and you and I were probably in the same room at the same time. I was doing a music editor job at Zodiac News Service, and you were with us for a short time before you moved on to KFRC. But there were some great, Bill Graham's club, the Old Waldorf. I spent way too much time there, but it was just a hotbed of any new music that was coming through. Graham, if it wasn't on a arena show, he would have it in the Old Waldorf.
The Old Waldorf was amazing. Were you by any chance at the Iggy Pop show there?
Oh God, yes. I've been a long time Iggy fan from the early Stooges day, even through his more recent stuff. Yeah, he came through. I unfortunately missed him in Austin when they came through with that last iteration of the Stooges, but he's just a force of nature.
That was such an amazing concert for me, and so many at the Old Waldorf were great. They didn't have to all be punk, but for example, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. That show was intense. I loved that show.
Yeah, his early shows. I saw him at Winterland when he was an opening act, and that was pretty interesting. Seeing him as an opening act, and he was intense, and the crowd was just like, "Whoa, who is this guy?" But there was a lot of that going on in the Bay Area, and that's just, that was my life for a long time. And like you, I moved out of radio when it started to go south in the Reagan administration, and moved into working with bands and producing concerts. But the whole thing of radio was just such a wonderful thing. I started in the mid '60s in the same place where John and I grew up. And you worked with Dave Cook.
Well, first I'd like to say that Dave Cook was the one who brought Joe Interrante in from Texas, who became the news director, who was my news director when I was an intern, and then hired me as a news editor, and basically was my mentor for my news career. She was amazing. She passed away this year, sad to say, and was just a wonderful part of my life and my mentor in news, as I mentioned. And when I went into writing rock radio specials, it was basically due to Joe Interrante recommending me to Dave Sholin in the first place to do the Beatles special. So that was exciting. And once all that started, and eventually getting into the John Lennon and Yoko interview, I felt so guilty and so horrible after that I really wasn't sure that I wanted to get started doing music and radio again. So I finished up the interviews that I had left that I'd already scheduled with RKO, including Barry Manilow and Neil Diamond. And I think I had a Devo interview too that had been scheduled, and a number of others. And I just didn't really want to be on the air anymore or necessarily write radio specials, but I got jobs with other companies, and then eventually went to work for Dick Clark, and not only wrote his weekly radio countdown show, but I ghost wrote his newspaper column for him, his syndicated newspaper column. And then once that was over, I got a job in New York to write a TV show, TV 2000, for the USA Network. So that took me into TV. And then when I came back to LA, I pretty much continued in video and TV production, and I ended up doing more music. I did a number of video magazines, music video magazines for BMG, everything from Metalhead, which was heavy metal, to Slammin', which was rap and hip hop, to a country music video magazine, which was possibly the most popular. And that was very exciting. And then after that, I pretty much was in TV doing promotion and pilots and all that sort of thing, and continued doing that through the pandemic, which of course put an end to production for a while. And to be honest, now that I've written the book, which I started to do finally during the pandemic, that's my full-time job.
You mentioned several different kinds of music you were writing about and associated with. Did you ever find yourself having to cultivate an enthusiasm for music that you didn't really care for?
Well, I don't think there's any music I don't really care for, to be honest.
I was wondering, yeah.
I'm not a huge classical music fan, and yet there are some pieces and things that I do like. And I love reggae music. I love blues. Obviously, I love rock and roll. There's some rap and hip hop that I like, though it's not my number one favorite. And there's plenty of country music and country music artists that I like. And it was one of my extreme privileges to spend so much time in Nashville, hanging out with plenty of country music artists, some of my favorite being Clint Black, Marty Stewart, a number of them. So yeah, so I've had a great time all the way around.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time working with country artists when I got into concert production for several promoters in Northern California. And I was not a big country music fan, but because I was from Texas, they had me do these shows as production manager because I was able to communicate with the guys that it was a problem. Some of the Northern California production guys just didn't get country music, and so they would always end up pissing off the country stars and their crews. I spoke the language, and I still have a little bit of a Texas accent, sometimes more than others, depending on what I've been drinking. But country music grew on me, and I've actually started to listen to some of it. There's some of it, the hardcore redneck stuff is kind of loses me. But I found from working in radio, you got to appreciate stuff. In my case, whether I liked it, I worked at a station that played nothing but elevator music, but I got to learn how to do a set of elevator music. It's just you have to adapt to the music as it changes.
Wow. Yeah. For example, I produced Garth Brooks' very first West Coast interview, and another great country partial rock musician that I love, Dwight Yoakam. I mean, all of these people we featured in my country music video magazine, and so many others. It was very exciting.
What do you think about internet radio? I know there's a lot of internet radio stations that are missing the rap. They don't have a DJ breaking in and intervening with, a bit of banter. Do you think that we've lost something there? I'm thinking about things like Soma is a really good example. I really love Soma. They have, their curation is pretty stellar. You know what I'm talking about, Soma. I'm sure you're familiar with them, but there's no conversation. It's all just music.
Yeah, and though I do have memberships in a number of internet radio stations, it's still not as exciting for me, to be honest, as listening to the radio, whether turning it on in my house or my car. It's something that's always been big for me. And I always, for example, tell my husband that I like listening to radio on the air because you never know if there's an important news thing that comes up, it will automatically be talked about, as opposed to you never find out about it for hours later if you're just listening to something already recorded on the internet. So that's important to me.
Yeah, I've always loved to have, you know, a local radio station, even local AM stations on the radio when I'm driving across country. You get to learn a lot about the places you're passing through. But that's kind of gone away because all of a sudden, all these local radio stations were just plugged in to some big conglomerate that's feeding them their own programming, and there's very little in the way of actual local radio in a lot of these small towns. And when I was growing up, the local radio stations were the lifeblood of the community. That's how you found out what was going on. And if there was an emergency, they were the people that talked you through it. But you don't hear much of that anymore.
Well, an example is, as I wrote about in my book, is one day there I was at KFRC all alone in the newsroom because everybody else was out to lunch and they needed somebody to stay, just to make sure that if anything happened, that I could take care of it. And it was when I was a news editor. And all of a sudden, all of the machines in the room started blaring and paper started rolling out, and I thought, oh my God, what's going on? And I ran over and tore off one of the sheets, and it said that Elvis Presley had died. So immediately I ran into the disc jockey booth with the sheet and told the jock. And because I was there and ran in right away, we were no doubt the first station in San Francisco that day to talk about Elvis's passing, which was really sad, very, very tragic, and unfortunate. And but at least being there and being ready to work if something was announced like that, a news story, that gave me the ability to let people know.
Yeah, I was out of town when that happened. I was, music editor at Zodiac, and I went up to visit a woman friend in Humboldt County. She was a quote unquote farmer up there, and I missed the whole thing. I got back and I had not listened to the radio or anything during my travels up north, and I get into town and my answering machine at my house was just melted down with people. Well, what about Elvis? And I'm like, what? And that was pretty embarrassing. But that was one of those dates that live in infamy, as they say, that you always have a reference to. Talking to anyone, they always can refer to that date and the Kennedy assassination, and of course, December 8th. And we've kind of been wandering all over, but the Lennon interview, that was an important thing for you or for you and your team, but it was also an important thing that it exists and can be looked at now all these years later. How many people have contacted you about the Lennon interview and the book? Have you received good feedback from hardcore Beatles fan, bad or indifferent?
Well, I'm happy to say that even though the book technically hasn't been released yet by my publisher, that's going to happen on the 43rd anniversary, which is December 8th. It's been available for pre-order for several months now, and on both my publisher's website as well as Amazon, Barnes and Noble, almost all the other bookstores. And it's actually been getting quite a good response. And that's exciting. And the people who have read advance copies of it, my publisher's press copy version that's sent out to potential reviewers and podcast hosts like you, that sort of thing. The reaction's been really good. And I'm so excited to hear that, because it makes me happy, not to think that, oh, wow, it's going to sell a lot of books, but that people not only care about reading about John Lennon and the Beatles and other rock stars, but also my life story and how it wraps around all that. And that's that's super important to me, to be able to let people know what it meant to me all these years, and all the guilt that I felt all these years, and how I'm really trying to get over it, but I never will. So I can't wait to hear when people read it, how they react, and hopefully read their glowing five-star reviews. And we'll see.
You mentioned the guilt you felt. Uh, Go into some more depth on that. How did that develop over time, or has it gotten better, worse, as you reflect on what you experienced and what you were looking forward to and what actually happened?
The guilt is with me to this day, and no doubt always will be, and was there from the minute that I heard that John had been shot, even though that was the first announcement, not that he had been killed, but they just said that he had been shot and was in the hospital. And I was still in New York. The rest of my RKO team and Bert Keane from the record company had already gotten on the plane to fly back to the West Coast, but I was staying in New York that night, and I was with my friend eating dinner. When we got back to his apartment, he was just about to open the door, and he told me, "Oh, I left the radio on because that way, if anybody tries to break in, they'll think that somebody's home." So when he opened the door, we heard on the radio a news announcer say, the bulletin, John Lennon had been shot and was in the hospital. And I immediately ran out into the middle of the street, grabbed a cab, went to the hospital. And there I saw through the big glass door Yoko Ono hanging on to, who I later found out was David Geffen, crying hysterically. And the minute I saw her, even though I wanted so much to run in and say, "Oh, Yoko, I'm so sorry," I realized that some tragedy had happened, that it wasn't just John being shot, that John was obviously dead, that he'd been assassinated. And so I didn't want to go in and freak out Yoko and remind her of that afternoon. And so I instead immediately called the RKO network and told Joe Interrante, who'd been my news director at KFRC, who was now the head of the network in New York, what I was pretty sure had happened. And she had me come in, and I spent the night doing interviews and writing stories, for everything from newspaper to radio station to TV stations all over the country, all over the world, actually. And then that next morning, I was on the Today Show talking about it, and it was horrifying, and it just made me feel awful and guiltier every minute that went by. And I flew back after the Today Show to San Francisco to immediately write the John Lennon special, which was not originally supposed to be written and aired until February, till Valentine's Day. It was going to be a love special, basically, that would air on Valentine's Day, but instead it aired 5 days following John Lennon's assassination. And Dave Sholin voiced it, and I dedicated it to Yoko Ono, and it was a 3-hour special. It didn't include the entire interview. Obviously, RKO never did put that out, but the special aired and had tons of listeners. It aired on the day that Yoko had the 10 minutes of silence in memory of John. And it's stuck with me ever since. And I've felt guilty ever since. And that's why I couldn't write my book right away, definitely, because there was so much guilt in me. And the interesting thing, as I also write about in my book, is when John autographed, he begged me to be able to autograph Yoko's book Grapefruit, which I brought my copy with me to the interview. And he said, "Oh, I wrote the introduction. Can I please autograph it too?" And I said, "Well, yes, of course." And when he autographed it, I said, "Thank you so much." And he said, "Oh, I'm happy to do it, because that's something I love, is when people give me their books, I want them to autograph it. And I said, oh, well, when I come out with my book, I'll definitely send you an autographed copy. And he seemed very excited. So after that, after he was killed, the idea of writing a book and not being able to autograph it and send it to John, it just didn't have as much emotional importance to me anymore. So it took me years and years and decades, not just the guilt, but also because I was so busy working and everything that I didn't really have time. And it wasn't until the pandemic started and TV production was laid to rest for a while that I did have time and finally sat down to write the book. And to be honest, it was somewhat hard because I've never been somebody who wrote a daily diary, so I didn't have all the memories. I had to remember them, and as you get older, your memory it gets problematic. So it was really hard for me that first year to remember everything and get it all together and finally finish writing my book and get a publisher, which was also very hard because even though I originally had a literary agent, partway during the pandemic, he said, I can't represent you anymore and find you a publisher because publishers don't want non-celebrity memoirs these days because there's so many coming out. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? But luckily, I was able to find a good independent traditional publisher because I'm not somebody who could even begin to think of self-publishing my own book. And it's all worked out so far.
I don't want to bring up a painful memory, but I don't think you mentioned specifically why you felt guilty, what the source of your feeling of guilt was.
Well, a couple of the sources of feeling my guilt. The first was, as I mentioned, when I read the part of my first chapter, was knowing that being born on a certain day, as well as the rest of my RKO team, that's what was used to determine what would be the best day to have the John and Yoko interview. Mm-hmm. And that turned out to be December 8th, which was absolutely horrifying in the long run. It was, to me, the day that music died, and the second part of being extremely guilty feeling after all these years was the contact I had with the asshole who turned out to be John Lennon's assassin. And it was horrifying to realize that this creep that had been bugging me and wouldn't stop asking me questions following the interview would be the one who turned out to shoot and kill John hours later. And my guilt was, why didn't I realize that being such a creep that I should have gone over to the security department at the Dakota and said, get rid of this guy. He shouldn't be here. And maybe they would have called the police, and had the police come, or even the security guys looked at him, maybe they would have realized that he had a gun in his coat pocket, which I didn't see or wouldn't have recognized because that wasn't something I knew a lot about. So I felt a lot of guilt over that.
That was at a time when that sort of thing didn't really happen the way it happens today. So I can't imagine why you would, even suspect that such a thing that he would be carrying something like that. But I can't imagine why anybody wanted to shoot John Lennon. That guy's always been a real mystery to me. And I don't know that I'll ever figure it out.
Yeah. And I never mention that guy's name.
Yeah.
Printed in my book because I don't want to give him the publicity that he was so much after, one of the main reasons why he did it. And I hope that he continues to stay in prison and dies there. And just
I met a woman once who had dated that guy, which I thought was pretty weird. So, how about Yoko? What were your feelings about Yoko? I always felt that she was people were so dismissive of her, and I think she's a major talent. How do you feel about her?
I loved hooking up with her. It was amazing. At the beginning of our interview, she and John were upstairs with Annie Leibovitz from Rolling Stones, taking what turned out to be probably the most incredible photos together, especially the one of John naked on the floor, laying with Yoko, holding her. She was fully dressed. An amazing photo. And Yoko came down earlier while Annie was still finishing up with John's photos. And just connecting with her right off the bat was so exciting, being able to talk about what prompted double fantasy and the dialogue between men and women that John and Yoko were so excited about giving to people, and helping couples come back and retain their relationships like he and Yoko did. And it was amazing. And I just adored talking to her. I had been a fan of hers, even though I didn't really understand all about conceptual art necessarily, or her solo music career. It was exciting to hook up with her and hear her talk about things, and know that she was the mother of the son that she and John were so thrilled with. Beautiful boy, as John said.
Yeah, very talented guy too in his own right. I was fortunate to actually see Yoko perform with Sean, a band that Sean put together at South by Southwest just a few years ago. And it was quite a performance. Her vocals made me think of John Coltrane. It was pretty amazing.
I bet.
Yeah. I never dreamed I would actually see Yoko perform. That was I don't think she performs very much, actually.
Well, not anymore, certainly, now that she's 90. But one of the exciting things about the interview was not only did every once in a while she would start to sing a couple lines of a song, but so did John. And so that to me was the ultimate performance. It wasn't in a venue on a stage, but it was John sitting right next to me on a love seat and Yoko sitting right next to me in a chair. It was super cool.
The breakup of the Beatles was always being pinned on Yoko by people who really didn't know what was going on with the band. But if you study the history of how they broke up, they were on the way to break up. It had nothing to do with Yoko so much. It was they were getting older. Their music was different. Each of the members was going in a different direction finally, and it's just the thing that happens to bands. I've studied a lot of different bands that broke apart, and it was that artistic differences thing. It happens, and the fact that people would blame it on Yoko, I thought was just bogus. It just was. She happened to be along when the band was starting to fall apart.
Yeah, that's exactly what John said. And even though we were told before the interview started to not bring up the Beatles and not bring up the past, John and Yoko both did themselves, which was very cool. And John was very clear in saying that no, Yoko didn't break up the Beatles. That was not the reason. People thought it was, but that had nothing to do with it. And then when I had interviewed George Martin, previous to that, the producer, he was the one who told me about the Beatles breakup before we even interviewed John and Yoko, and they had said that Yoko had nothing to do with it. So that was very cool.
Yeah, it's the old it's men trying to blame women for whatever problem they've encountered, because most of the people I've seen that were blaming Yoko were older guys who just needed someone to blame, and she was the obvious target because she was the new person in the mix there, and it was all seemed rather ridiculous. in retrospect.
Well, as George Martin told me during the interview, which was at KFRC following the release of his book, which had just come out, he said, I guess the unhappiest time was during the Let It Be period when everybody was at each other's throats. I was quite surprised when Paul rang me up one day and said, look, we want to get back into the studio and we want you to produce us as we used to. Will you come and do another album with us? And he said that was how we did Abbey Road, and that was our swan song, which George said somewhat sadly. We kind of knew that it was the last one, but it was a very happy recording. So we all ended up very happily ever after, which made me excited to hear that.
You've also interviewed other members of the Beatles. And did you ever inquire about their response to Yoko, or did that ever come up?
No, I didn't, because, again, what we were told was to concentrate on what we were there to interview. For example, we were there to interview in London Paul and Linda and the latest lineup of Wings and their latest release. And with George Harrison, that interview was primarily because I was writing a show called Top 100 of the 70s that his song was going to be in. And so I needed to talk to him about that and also interview him more for the elongation of the Beatles special. We were blossoming it up to 17 hours. So that was pretty much the concentration. And none of them had anything bad to say about Yoko anyway, or they would have. And it wasn't something that I was going to, try and get out of them, because there was no point.
Well, you talked with them about a lot of different subjects. And did John bring up much about his lost weekend, when he was separated from Yoko?
Yeah, he said it was the most miserable time of his life, and that he was so horrified to not be with her that he had been told by Yoko to get out. He didn't leave her. She told him to leave, and she hooked him up with the assistant, May Pang, that she sent with him, that he was going to be living with and loving with in Los Angeles. And John still wasn't very happy. He spent most of that time being drunk and having headaches, as he described to us afterwards. He said basically for 18 months straight. And then Yoko would join in and say, yes, that she had a headache during that time as well, because not even because she missed John as much as what she really hated was all kinds of reporters and news people coming up to her and saying, oh, how are you living without John Lennon? And they didn't understand that she was the one who'd sent him away, not that he had left her. And John said that, initially he tried to react to being happy to be leaving, because it was the first time since he was 20 that he hadn't been married. But on the other hand, he was just miserable. So I understand and I believe him.
The stuff he did in that lost weekend, which was more than a weekend, the recording sessions were apparently pretty chaotic, and I'm just surprised that he actually survived that. Just some of the extreme drinking and drug use that was reported to have been occurring. And did either of them talk about his recovery from that problem?
Well, he talked about coming back and immediately becoming a house husband and being with Yoko, because she was about to have their son in her 40s, which was amazing. And he was so thrilled to have spent the last 5 years raising Sean and becoming the father that he was never able to be with his first son, Julian, when he was married to Cynthia, because that was the first year of the Beatles. And he was so busy having to tour and having to come up with singles all the time and albums every 6 months. The record company made them. And so he said he had no time or energy or desire to be a father because he was too busy being the musician, that he needed to be. So this time he was able to put music in the back of his life and be able to be a father. And he was very excited, but he was also very excited to finally get back into the studio with Yoko. Of course, he was thrilled to be working with her and creating with her. And that was a major part of the interview, talking about how excited they were to be working together and recording together and hopefully coming up touring together, and doing all their own songs and not having to do Beatles songs or anything like that, but all of their recent Double Fantasy and Upward songs.
I recall that in addition to this Lost Weekend thing where I guess he was hanging out with Harry Nilsson and getting drunk a lot, there was also something about how Lennon had used heroin at some point and had a bit of a problem with that. Was that later or earlier than his Lost Weekend?
Well, we didn't talk about that, to be very honest.
Didn't come up?
And what I do know is because I've seen the video of him with Bob Dylan in the car when they were traveling together at one point, and he was on drugs. They were both high. And that was very sad in a way, because to see them fight and not get along in that video was bad. But so that would have been earlier. But in LA, he was pretty much on drugs and drunk all the time, according to him.
But once he went home, he quit cold turkey. Is that what happened?
I don't know about that. I'm pretty sure he was still smoking pot and,
Well, yeah.
Can't tell you what else, but he was definitely looking at his life in a different way because he had a son to raise and he wanted to be the best father possible. And it was obvious that he was working super hard at doing that.
And my understanding was that they had a lot of business interests by then, and that Yoko, being from a banking family, she had a head for business, and that she became business manager for all of their holdings, and he just stayed home with Sean and was, as they say, house husband, Mr. Mom, I guess. Is that pretty much correct?
Absolutely. Yoko spent the bulk of her day and a lot of the nights in the office because she was dealing with people not just in New York, but all over the world. So she had different times to have to get in contact with them. And when John and Sean would go on vacations together to Bermuda, for example, where John started coming up with songs for Double Fantasy, Yoko was in New York working and doing all of their stuff for their company together. And she was thrilled to do that because, as she said, she wasn't a child rearer. That wasn't her thing. And she was more into working and getting the business done. And she was very flattered that John gave her that ability. And not only that, but she mentioned that he had given her a blank check. And she put that on the wall because she was so flattered that he would trust her enough and be that secure with her running the business, which she was extremely wonderful at.
One of the things that really struck me was they were talking about perhaps going on tour after they recorded the follow-up to Double Fantasy. And did that seem to be a serious discussion, or is it just one of those things they were toying with?
Well, John originally not only wasn't he excited, but he wasn't planning to go on tour at all. But he was saying that there he was in the studio, and one of his session musicians said, wow, this has been so much fun. Let's keep doing this. Let's take this out live. Let's go on the road. And John thought to himself, no, session musicians are expensive. We'll have to pay everybody to do this. And I don't want to do this until we have more albums down, because I don't want to even begin to think of having to do songs from the past, Beatles songs or anything like that. And at that point, that's when he actually started singing Yesterday, which I thought was so cool, saying that he didn't want to do that live. He wanted to do Double Fantasy and the songs that were going to be on their next album. And even what he said then was about to be their third album. So he was thinking about it, but the big thing in his brain was, I don't know if I want to go do a huge venue. I might want to do small clubs. That's how he wanted to relate to an audience more. But he said that if he didn't, then would all the critics say, oh my God, John isn't popular enough to be in a major venue like he used to be. So John was still kind of wondering about what he was going to do. He hadn't really made the plans yet.
There was really a catch-22 there, because no matter what decision they made, it would be the wrong decision for certain parts of their fan base. And we're getting toward the end of our hour, and you and Dave Sholin conducted an amazing interview. And is there a part of that interview that really, really has stayed with you after all these years that you can talk about? One section, one subject.
Well, thank you for complimenting our interview. We did have a wonderful time, and we're so grateful that John and Yoko were so open and incredible. And the entire interview was so amazing to me. And even though I knew how John and Yoko had met and got together, John and Yoko both told me the entire story of their original meetup, and it was so cool. And not only that, but their first date, which was 2 years later, and how that ended up being the night that they recorded Two Virgins, and the next morning when the sun came up, ended up making love for the first time. And it was so beautiful to hear them talk about that and remember it, and just see the looks on their faces and the joy of memory. And not only that, but leading up to it, John talking about how excited he was to hear Yoko sing while he was singing, and how she brought out in him all the different part of his recording ability. And he imitated her singing, and then sang about how he came through with a lot of what he put on Two Virgins. And that was super thrilling. And another part of the interview that was amazing was towards the end, talking about personal things and being friends. We were going to all be friends, and we made plans to get together in San Francisco just 2 weeks later, when John and Yoko were going to be coming out, and we were all ready to eat dinner together at what was turned out to be Yoko's very favorite Japanese restaurant in the city. And I was so looking forward to that. And because John and Yoko and I had so many coincidental and exciting similarities, even though we were all born in different countries and in different decades, it was so thrilling to think of everything that we had similar together, that I was really excited about becoming friends with them and talking about so much more that we had in common. So I was just looking forward to everything.
Well, you've finished the book, and it's coming out in December. After that, do you have another book in you?
Well, since this was my early life and career memoir, there's more I could write, and I could also write about a lot of the other interviews and rock specials and things that I've conducted and written. I'm not sure what my next book will be, because it's going to be a while, because right now I'm concentrating on getting people to read this one and finding out how much they like it and what they love about it. And hopefully they do love a lot about it. And so we'll see. And if people have suggestions, I'm definitely open for it.
Well, I'll put it in order for it whenever it comes out and whatever it is. I enjoyed reading the book. It was just, you actually made me cry a couple of times. Reawakening things that I experienced in the Bay Area and in music. And you captured it so well. It's definitely a great read.
Wow, well, thank you. And people who are interested in checking it out, I hope you go to the website, which is confessionsofarockandrollnamedropper.com, which has everything from description of the book to segments from the book to my bio to links where you can pre-order it and events that are coming up in terms of book launch and signing, things that are going to be happening. So hopefully it all works out.
I hope so. John, any more questions there?
No, I'll just say feel free to drop our names anytime, anywhere.
We're not. We'll beg for a name drop.
Drop them, but don't kick them.
This has been a lot of fun, Laurie. We have to do this again sometime.
My pleasure.
Yeah, that'd be great. Let's do it soon.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure meeting you both.
Pleasure meeting you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lepkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.